This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 9 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. On June 5th, 1850, in the heart of Dixie, Chambers County, Alabama, Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett was born to a wealthy slave-owning Georgian plantation owner. But only 3 years later, the Garrett family would move to Louisiana. Pat, as he would become known, was the first son and second child of 7 children, and he'd be raised on their 1,800-acre cotton plantation. Eventually, he'd work at his father's store before that great and terrible war brought the family and its wealth to their knees. At the conclusion of that war, 34 Garrett slaves would be set free, and the Federals would confiscate most of Pat's father's cotton. This destitution did not serve Pat's parents well, and in 1867, his mother died. A year later, Pat would also lose his father. Once everything of the Garretts was sold and the children were moved into Pat's older sister's home with her husband, Pat left for the West. It was 1869. All he took with him was his rifle, saddle, bridle, and horse. For the story of Pat Garrett, I will rely mostly on Mark Lee Gardner's To Hell on a Fast Horse. The book is roughly 4/5 about Pat Garrett, which is why so much of what he says about Billy the Kid is either wrong or, well, no, it's wrong. And I did find out, after interviewing George R. Matthews, the author of Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend, that Mark Lee Gardner wrote a book on Pat Garrett. But the publishing company forced him to add Billy the Kid. So, all of my harsh words earlier about Mark Lee Gardner were explained by George R. Matthews, thankfully. That interview will be out after the series is done. But Mark Lee Gardner's coverage on Pat Garrett is second to none. The book is almost an apologia for the lawman who will kill the young gunfighter many, many years from where I'm at in Pat's story now. Long after the killing of Billy the Kid, during the Great Depression gangster era, Pat Garrett's image would suffer until eventually portrayals of Pat Garrett on screen became a sick distortion of the actual man. It seems like Gardner was trying to correct the lies of an industry that profits on them. I appreciate his effort, and it makes for an enjoyable read. But if you want to learn about Billy the Kid, To Hell on a Fast Horse is not what I would recommend. That would be George R. Matthews' book. But if you want to learn about Pat Garrett, To Hell on a Fast Horse is a good source. So once in Texas, after he left Louisiana, Pat Garrett, well, actually, I'll just read Gardner. He describes a little of these years. Quote, "There are a number of stories about Pat Garrett's Texas years, that he killed a black man, started and then abandoned a family, helped drive a herd of Texas cattle to Dodge City, but they remain just that. Stories. Garrett first went to Dallas, but soon located in Lancaster, 12 miles from Dallas, which was also the home of some old Claiborne Parish neighbors. There, the strapping young fellow tried his hand at what he knew best, farming." End quote. Pat Garrett would farm near Dallas for 2 years before being hired on as a cowboy by a passing cattleman. So from Dallas, Pat rode north towards Kansas. But that job didn't last long, and once in Kansas he was hired on as a buffalo hunter. The buffalo hunter he hired on with was a native Georgian, truly the best of us. And his name, this Georgian's name, was Willis Skelton Glenn. Glenn said of Pat that he seemed, quote, the tallest, most long-legged specimen I ever saw. There was something very attractive and impressive about his personality, even on a first meeting, end quote. Pat seemed to enjoy buffalo hunting, and he stayed on 3 years, eventually becoming a salaried hunter of the wild and woolly beasts. Buffalo hunting was hard and tough work, though, and the land was even tougher and harder. And this can get to a man. Unfortunately, it would get to Pat in the autumn of 1876. The same year, Billy the Kid would escape from jail over in Silver City. But on the Llano Estacado region of far west Texas, while out hunting buffalo, Pat Garrett and a buddy, an Irishman named Joe Briscoe, would find themselves in an unfortunate and deadly scuffle. Glenn, the leader of the Glenn Garrett outfit of buffalo hunters, he had to go to town for some gun parts, and in his absence, he left Pat in charge. I will now let Gardner, into Hell on a Fast Horse, describe what happened next. Quote, just before breakfast the next day, Briscoe walked to a nearby pool of water with a piece of soap and began scrubbing away at his linen handkerchief. A short time later, he walked back to camp, muttering to himself, it was no use to wash in that damn water. Garrett overheard Briscoe and immediately chimed in. Anyone but a damn Irishman, he said, would have more sense than to try to wash anything in that water. Yes, Briscoe replied. You damn Americans think you are damn smart and know a damn sight. Garrett was not about to take any sass from the young man and let fly with his fist, almost knocking Briscoe to the ground. Briscoe righted himself and took a swing at Garrett, missing, and then ran for the axe the cook used to split firewood. Realizing Briscoe's intent, Garrett lunged for a .45 caliber pistol that was used around the camp to shoot skunks and other varmints. As Briscoe came at him, fire in his eyes, Garrett turned and pulled the trigger. The two were so close together that the exploding powder from the pistol scorched Briscoe's clothing. The lead bullet punched into his left side at the waistline, then ripped across his body and exited on the opposite side just above the lower pocket of his otter skin vest. The young man collapsed at Garrett's feet. A stunned and trembling Garrett helped the cook carry Briscoe to one of the bedrolls. When the lad complained of being cold, they quickly scrounged more blankets for him. Then Briscoe called out to his killer. Pat, come here, please. Garrett walked over to Briscoe, wishing it was all a bad dream, trying somehow to make sense of what refused to make sense. I am dying, Pat. Won't you forgive me? Yes, Garrett said, and then he returned to the campfire, tears streaming down his cheeks. Young Joe Briscoe lived only 20 more minutes. End all quotes. A couple days later, Glenn would return from town and Pat would tell the man what had happened. Glenn would say to Pat, quote, it's a pretty hard thing, Pat, for a man to lose his life that way, end quote. Comforting words, no doubt. Glenn then told Pat that he needed to go turn himself in at Fort Griffin, which was the same Fort Griffin that Robert E. Lee served at just 2 decades prior. Well, Pat did just that, and he turned himself in. Although a few days later he was back at camp, since the authorities had figured the killing was justified, and they had bigger fish to fry, like Comanche and Apache. In what would be a theme for the rest of Garrett's life, right up until he was murdered, the man had a money and a gambling problem. He never had money, and when he did, he'd gamble it away, back to square one. And coupled with that, he was a heavy drinker, and when he drank, he gambled. When he wasn't buffalo hunting, like during the off-season, he was gambling away his earnings in the famous buffalo hunting towns of Dodge City and the like. He claimed to have even met the famous lawman Bat Masterson, and many decades after this, fellow infamous lawman Wyatt Earp himself would remember meeting Pat Garrett on the plains. By 1877, the range was played out of buffalo. If you're interested in those beasts, my very first episode was over them. They are, in fact, my favorite mammal. But by 1877, after the herds were disappearing, and after 2 separate Comanche raids on their hides, raids which saw them lose hundreds of pelts, the Glenn Garrett Company dissolved. There was literally no future in hunting buffalo any longer anyways. From the Llano Estacado, Garrett, Glenn, and a buddy named Ross. Glenn Garrett, Glenn Ross, no, never mind. But Pat Garrett, Glenn, and a buddy named Ross decided, heck with the plains, and they headed west towards New Mexico. It was February 1878, the same month that John Tunstall would be murdered. The same month the Lincoln County War would begin. But the 3 haggard men would not go to Lincoln County. Instead, they would wander into Fort Sumner, which was led by Pete Maxwell after his father died, Paulita Maxwell's brother. I talked a lot about Fort Sumner in the last episode. I like Gardner's description of Pat Garrett and his comrades, so I will let him tell the tale of their arrival to Fort Sumner. Quote, Pete Maxwell and the residents of Fort Sumner were accustomed to seeing some rough characters come in off the surrounding nothingness. But the 27-year-old Garrett must have been among the scariest. When he arrived in February 1878, his hair was long and scraggly, and he had a scruffy beard. It was impossible on the frontier to get store-bought pants for a man 6 feet 4 inches tall, so Pat had sewn nearly 2 feet of buffalo hide to the bottoms of his duck canvas trousers. His drooping, broad-brimmed hat was grimy from campfire smoke and being handled time and again by its owner's greasy hands, and his belt bristled with skinning knives and cartridges for his Sharps buffalo gun. Glenn and Ross looked nearly as rough, and all 3 men were hungry and broke. End quote. I can picture them wandering off the eastern New Mexican plains now. I imagine it's raining and it's getting dark. Pat Garrett was a very tall man, 6'4". That's tall for 1878. It did not take long for Garrett to secure the 3 of them jobs as cowboys for Pete Maxwell's extensive herd. And shortly after acquiring a job, they got some lodgings in the fort-turned small town. At Fort Sumner, Pat Garrett learned Spanish. He became a well-liked figure, and he seemed to fit in. I will now quote a young woman who lived at the fort, the same young woman who would have married Billy the Kid if he had ever bothered to ask. Paulita. She said of Pat Garrett, quote, He was an easygoing, agreeable man, a good storyteller, and full of dry humor. He was fond of a social glass, and was a great hand to play poker and Monte. End quote. Just like Billy the Kid, and actually in the same place and at the same time, Pat Garrett also really liked to dance. He attended as many of them, the bailes, as he could. These dances were a region-wide affair every single time. Women from as far away as 50 miles would come to dance and meet single young men. I've been to Fort Sumner. There ain't much there, or at least around it. Another girl that floated past Billy the Kid was Sally Chisholm, and she had this to say of Pat Garrett. She said he walked with a certain, quote, shining grace that suggested power and sureness. Despite his crooked mouth and crooked smile, which made his whole face seem crooked, he was a remarkably handsome man. End quote. Well, one woman in town certainly agreed with Sally and Paulita, and her name was Juanita Martinez. In the autumn of 1879, Pat Garrett would marry Juanita. And attending that wedding, there is very little doubt, were Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard. Maybe even Charlie Beaudry. Small world. For Pat Garrett, it was a small and a sad world. During the wedding, his brand new bride, Juanita, would faint on the dance floor. And in an extremely tragic turn of events, she would die the next day. And I try to imagine something like that, but it's hard. The record is murky at this point in Pat's life. We do know Glenn and Ross left for elsewhere, and we do know Pat stayed, despite the tragedy of his brief marriage. George R. Matthews in Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend, he suggests Pat was a bartender at this time, and I tend to believe it. Mark Lee Gardner says the same thing, except he says a whole lot more. Because again, Mark Lee Gardner wanted to write a book just on Pat Garrett. I mean, imagine doing all that and then having to shoehorn Billy the Kid in. So I'm a lot more lenient on what Mark Lee Gardner has to write on Billy the Kid now. Here's a paragraph from To Hell on a Fast Horse that sums up this portion before Pat Garrett becomes sheriff of Lincoln County. Quote, "Some accounts say Garrett opened a short-lived eating place with his saved cowboy wages. He is also said to have raised hogs and eventually partnered in a saloon and grocery business. In late 1879, Garrett and his friend Barney Mason opened a butcher shop. It might have been a success had they not been caught processing beef that did not belong to them. Garrett promised to pay the owners of the cattle, which he never did, and the shop went out of business after about a month. Whether or not all these ventures really took place, they do reflect a pattern in Garrett's life. A proud man, Pat Garrett was determined to get ahead, to be successful, and thus retrieve a semblance of what his family had lost in Louisiana. He was willing to try just about anything that had the promise of financial rewards, and, if not a certain social status, at least respect. Pat was a working devil," recalled his friend John Meadows. "He'd work at anything." That anything would eventually include the job of manhunter. End all quotes. And the man he would hunt, at least one of them, the first one, the man that he would hunt that would make him famous was, of course, Billy the Kid. I would now like to read a page or so of Mark Lee Gardner's To Hell on a Fast Horse. It talks a lot about Billy and Garrett and their shooting. Like abilities, not a shootout. I don't wish to summarize it or put it into my own words or shoehorn it in somewhere, so I'll just read it now. This is pages 91 and 92. More than most, it seems, Garrett and the Kid had experienced the tragic loss of loved ones. There was a good deal that the two had in common, actually. Certain leadership qualities, for one. I'm going to interject real quick and say Billy the Kid never led any group of outlaws, so let's just get past that. So, certain leadership qualities, for one, and their well-known fondness for the baile, horse racing, and gambling. Both were men you would want on your side in a fight. Garrett and the Kid were not good friends at Fort Sumner, but they were not enemies either. They saw each other frequently enough, and they had a healthy respect for each other, certainly each other's ability to take care of himself. Garrett was usually serious and the Kid was usually boisterous, and they each had a reputation as a better-than-average shot with a 6-gun. They were considered the two best shooters at Fort Sumner. On a slow day, and there were more than a few of those there on the Pecos, the Kid and Garrett might take a part in an impromptu shooting match. Billy was ambidextrous, and people said he could shoot a pistol with one hand just as well as the other, although he favored the right hand whenever he got into a jackpot. According to Paulita Maxwell, Billy was better than Garrett with the revolver. She remembered a time when a terror-stricken jackrabbit on a Fort Sumner lane somehow managed to dodge every bullet Garrett fired at him. The Kid whipped out his revolver and pancaked the rabbit with his first shot. Maybe this happened, maybe not. Others considered Garrett the better shot, possibly even the best man with a revolver in the entire Southwest. And Garrett did not rate Billy's shooting nearly as high as many who were acquainted with the Kid. When asked if Billy was a good shot, Garrett admitted that he was, but he added that the Kid was no better than the majority of men who were constantly handling and using 6-shooters. He shot well, though, and he shot well under all circumstances, whether in danger or not. That last was the key, of course. As Garrett remembered years later, a man with nerve behind a gun is worth 25 who are after him. There is no question that Billy Bonney had nerve, Joe Grant discovered that in January 1880. So, with that reading, and with the background of Pat Garrett, we are all caught up to the end of the previous episode. Gardner, then in the next paragraph or two, tells this extremely long story about the shooting of Joe Grant, which is the grifter, outlaw, wannabe guy who Billy shot in the head in the bar in Fort Sumner. And Mark Lee Gardner's telling seems more dime novel than reality. So I chose to go with Paco Anaya's story of the event that saw Billy justifiably kill the Texan grifter, instead of what Gardner writes. 4 days after that shooting in early 1880, some good luck finally came into the life of Pat Garrett when he married Apolinaria Gutierrez, the woman he would spend the rest of his tumultuous life with. From the readings, she was a faithful and a strong wife, and he loved her, despite his ways and his constant misfortune and sleeping around. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Apolinaria would survive the wedding, thankfully, and be by Pat's side until he's murdered on the side of a dusty road in southern New Mexico in 1908 by an unknown assailant, still to this day. But sometime in the spring of 1880, Pat and Apolinaria left Fort Sumner for Roswell, and that is in Lincoln County. The man who suggested the move was John Chisholm, who, if you'll remember, had earlier asked Governor Wallace to make Garrett a deputy U.S. Marshal and to place him in charge of stopping cattle theft at a place called Stinking Springs. Well, Pat Garrett's law career was about to take off. By March of 1880, Doc Scurlock left the Regulators and had skedaddled with his family to Texas. The former deputy sheriff and regulator would die at the age of 80 many, many years later. Shortly after his departure, Beaudry, Tom Folliard, and Billy the Kid would continue their cattle-stealing career. And this time, they would definitely steal from John Chisholm. Either they all stole them or Billy did by himself, but they stole 22 heads of cattle from Chisholm. And this would prompt Chisholm to press charges against Billy the Kid. He would never be arrested for the theft, nor would he appear in court. He learned his lesson. It also doesn't appear he'd attempt to steal any more of Chisholm's cattle. But this theft so angered Chisholm that he would ask Pat Garrett to move down to Roswell, near the Chisholm Ranch, and to eventually run for sheriff of Lincoln County. Why did Billy the Kid steal Chisholm's cattle after the man was so good to he and Tunstall and McSween and the Regulators? This is not mentioned in Matthew's book, so I am hesitant to cite it, and I think I forgot to ask him during our interview. But it's such a good story, and I enjoyed reading it, although it seems a little far-fetched. I'm not even sure who told this story. Maybe it was Chisholm years later. But I'll quote from Maurice G. Fulton on the probable cause of Billy the Kid turning against Chisholm. Quote, "A short time after the killing of Grant at Fort Sumner in January 1880, the Kid and John Chisholm happened to meet at Fort Sumner, and the Kid took the opportunity to make demand for $500 in payment for services to the Tunstall-McSween-Chisholm party's interests. Just as the mantle of leadership had fallen to McSween after Tunstall's murder, so Chisholm, following McSween's death, had been recognized as the guiding head." Quick interlude. I don't believe that's true. All right, back to Maurice G. Fulton. Since Tunstall's death, Billy had received no wages, though he had continued to serve, first under McSween, and then, so he understood, under the sponsorship of Chisholm. Further, he had helped in the elimination of some of the old Jesse Evans gang, which had been stealing Chisholm's cattle. Chisholm declined to pay even when the Kid threatened him with a pistol. Chisholm showed no loss of composure, even though he was looking into the muzzle of a revolver, and that, too, in the hands of a dangerous young desperado. Coolly reaching into his pocket for pipe and tobacco, Chisholm said in his slow, drawling speech, "Let me get a smoke, Billy. for then I can talk better. Now, Billy, listen. If you talked about that money until your hair was as white as mine, you could not convince me that I owed it to you." The kid kept his finger on the trigger, but Chisholm went on. "Billy, you couldn't shoot an honest man, could you? While he was looking you square in the eye? You have killed several men, I know, but they needed killing." By this time, the kid had begun to yield to the adroit attack, and Chisholm pressed home the advantage by a reminder of how during the Lincoln County War the McSween party hid out in the vicinity of South Spring River, and he had let them have whatever they needed from his store on credit. At this juncture, the kid lowered his pistol into the holster, but he did not relinquish his claim. "All right, Mr. Chisholm," he said, "but only for the present. If you won't pay me that $500 in money, I'll steal from your cattle until I get it." In this interview, Chisholm vindicated his confidence in his persuasiveness. An often made remark was that if he could talk 2 minutes to a man, no matter how angry or quarrelsome, he could pacify the boisterous one. But it had been as close a call as Chisholm perhaps had ever had, and he realized that. Henceforth, the kid would bear a grudge. End all quotes. Again, I don't know if that story is true, and I kind of doubt that it is, but I like it anyways. It sure does put a neat bow on the reasons for Billy pursuing Chisholm's cattle. But there's too much of a dime novel quality to the whole thing, and I don't think Billy the Kid would have acted that way towards Chisholm. But who knows? After Billy and or his friends stole from Chisholm, they would up their theft and continue to steal other ranchers' cattle. A few months later, in May, they stole up to 60 heads on the Texas Panhandle. Then again in July, they stole well over 20 from surrounding residents of Fort Sumner. And then later in the summer, it seems the three of them joined up with a group known as the Wilson Gang, although details of their meeting and joining are hazy. Now I say that, but George R. Matthews clears it up in our interview, so be on the lookout for that when it drops. By the autumn of 1880, though, there was this whole affair involving counterfeit money and men associated with Billy the Kid. That's this Wilson Gang. And the Wilson in the Wilson Gang is a cattle rustler and horse thief named Billy Wilson. Wilson had somehow got his hands on some counterfeit money, and he was, selling it or giving it away. This caused an alarm, and eventually a Secret Service agent, who besides guarding important politicians, Secret Service agents also deal in counterfeit money. Well, Agent Azaria Wild came to New Mexico to investigate. The man prodding this investigation was, of course, Jimmy Dolan, who was still angry about Billy the Kid testifying against him, and he wanted the young man dead, per their truce contract. Well, on October 6th, the previously introduced attorney, Ira Leonard, the murdered attorney Chapman's law partner, Leonard received a letter from Billy the Kid, and in the letter, Billy said he would testify against Billy Wilson, if he, Billy the Kid, received a pardon. Because the original pardon the kid depended on so heavily by the governor had still not been issued. The agent Wild, he then wrote a letter, and in it he stated, quote, "Antrim has recently written a letter to Judge Leonard, which has been shown to me in confidence that leads me to believe that we can use Antrim in these counterfeit cases, provided Governor Wallace will make good his written promises, and the U.S. Attorney Barnes will allow the case against Bonnie in the U.S. court to slumber and give him, Antrim, one more chance to reform. Judge Leonard has written Antrim to meet him at once for consultation. The chances are that the conversation will take place within the next week." End quote. Of course, the murderer Dolan of the house, he would place his bets against the kid yet again, and he convinced this Secret Service agent that instead of letting Billy come in, he should arrest all the remaining regulators and this Billy Wilson fellow and his men. Dolan would continue to lie and say that Billy had 17 other men with him in his outfit, and that Billy regularly came into Lincoln to play cards with Sheriff Kimbrell. Apparently, Dolan didn't like the new sheriff in town either. Now, that is not true. Billy didn't have 17 men with him, and he wasn't the leader of the Billy Wilson gang. That would have been Billy Wilson. And I don't believe that he came into Lincoln regularly. Agent Wild was sending a bunch of correspondence and all his plans to capture the outlaws through the mail. Obviously. Well, on October 13th, the mail was robbed right outside of Fort Sumner. I will let author George R. Matthews describe this mail heist. In his description, he will quote the Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper. Quote, 3 men stopped the buckboard and cut open and rifled 2 mailbags. Only one man approached the buckboard. He was on horseback, and 2 other men who remained a little off from the road were backing him. All 3 men were masked, and the 2 who stayed back wore only their underclothes. End quote. Robbers did not normally hold up the mail in their long johns, but men with few changes of clothes might be recognized by their outer garments. In his report, Wild accused Wilson, Bonney, Folliard, and Pickett as the robbers. Dave Rudabog, not mentioned by Wild, later confessed that he, Pickett, and Wilson had held up the U.S. mail. Folliard and Bonney were not involved. Rudabog and Tom Pickett had only recently come from Las Vegas and fallen in with Wilson, Bonney, and the others. End all quotes. So who is Rudabog and Tom Pickett? Rudabog was a boy from Illinois whose father died in the war between the states. And pretty much right from the start, the man was an outlaw. His career started in Arkansas before he moved on either to the Black Hills of South Dakota or the Green Hills of Texas. Either way, his story became intertwined with some of the most famous men in all of southwestern history. Somewhere along the track, Rudabog would rob a Santa Fe Railroad camp, and at this point, a man in Dodge City, Kansas, would be issued a temporary deputy U.S. Marshal star for the sole purpose of hunting down Rudabog. That man would be Wyatt Earp. If that wasn't incredible enough, Rudabog would flee south to Texas, where he'd stop in a small town known as Clear Fork. He didn't stay long, but while he was there, he spent an evening playing cards with none other than Doc Holliday. So Wyatt Earp comes to town and asks the saloon keeper if he's seen Rudabog, to which the saloon keeper would remark, "He left earlier, but I know Doc Holliday played a lot with him. Why don't you talk to him?" And that is how Wyatt Earp met Doc Holliday. And to make it even more incredible, Wyatt Earp would eventually tell Bat Masterson that Rudabog had left. 3 huge men in the history of the Wild West. I love Wyatt Earp, but the Georgian Doc Holliday has a special place in my heart. I'll never do a series over Wyatt. I say never. Probably won't do a series over Wyatt, but if I ever do a series over the Tombstone Men, it would be over Doc Holliday. So back in Kansas, Rudabog attempts to rob the Santa Fe Railroad, but it goes horribly wrong, and he and his men get nothing. Well, they did get captured shortly afterwards by Bat Masterson. Although he wasn't jailed long, on account of Masterson freeing the men if the men agreed to join Masterson's posse for the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad Company, because something known as the Railroad Wars was going on. And that's out of the scope of this series, but I believe Tom Horn may have briefly been a part of these Railroad Wars as well. If you want to hear about Tom Horn, sign up and become a Roadrunner subscriber. Anyways, Rudabog leaves Kansas and makes his way to Las Vegas, where he gets mixed up in more outlawry. He apparently robs some stagecoaches before he eventually shoots a deputy sheriff and then flees to Fort Sumner. Once there, he joined this Wilson gang of which Billy, Beaudry, and Tom Folliard are all now members of. What about Tom Pickett? He was the son of an ex-Confederate officer who got arrested at 17 for cattle rustling. He would then head to Kansas, where he'd meet up and join with Rudabog. Now, Pickett's later years are very interesting. He's an outlaw, yes, but he also becomes a justice of the peace, a town marshal, and eventually a deputy U.S. Marshal. And I tell you what, these old Western guys seem to always have one foot on both sides of the law. And they're usually wearing a star or a badge when they're on the side of the law. It's incredible. But at this moment in the story, Pickett's an outlaw with Rudabog, Wilson, Billy, Beaudry, and Tom, among others. But the core of outlaws that will be the focus of the rest of this episode are the two Billies, the two Toms, Beaudry, and Rudabog. All right. So Billy promised to testify against Wilson if he's issued the pardon he so desperately wants and needs. Dolan convinced the agent Wild to forget the pardon and just arrest him. Dolan also suggested the mail carrier theft was Billy's doing, although he was not there. So once Billy learned of the intent of arrest on Wild's part, the two never met up. Plus, the whole mail carrier robbery definitely threw a wrench in those plans. Meanwhile, the ranchers of the Texas Panhandle were fed up with the cattle rustling, so they formed an organization which hunted down the stolen cattle and proved without a doubt they were being taken to Lincoln County. Secret Service Agent Wild wrote exaggerating reports of the lawlessness, which was definitely rampant, but he suggested yet another Lincoln County war was brewing, although that wasn't possible, and he knew nothing of the original war. Still, the place did need to be cleaned up. And with county elections coming up, including the election for sheriff, maybe someone would be elected who could finally rid the town and territory of its degeneracy. Someone not associated with the House or McSween and the Regulators or the Santa Fe ring. Maybe an ex-buffalo hunter, a gambler, and a barkeep with a New Mexican wife who's familiar with Billy the Kid and the Regulators. Elections were held on November 2nd, 1880, and the man who won the Star of Lincoln County was Pat Garrett. Mark Lee Gardner, into Hell on a Fast Horse, writes of the election, quote, Garrett, who generally spoke in a low tone and rarely talked of himself, had not been the best campaigner for public office, but the people who supported him were interested in action, not words. Garrett handily won the election, receiving 320 votes to Kimbrell's 179. End quote. Pat Garrett had never been a lawman before, despite John Chisholm's suggestion that he ought to have been. The man who really pushed Garrett into running was a certain Captain J.C. Leah. He had recently bought all the buildings in Roswell and had, with Chisholm's help, suggested that Garrett leave Fort Sumner and move down to Roswell himself. Captain Leah had seen the violence, not only in Lincoln County, but especially earlier in Missouri after the war. And he wanted to make sure this large chunk of land in New Mexico became a safe place for all of its inhabitants. And that started with a new sheriff. Only a few days after being elected, but not yet being sworn in as sheriff, the Secret Service Agent Wild, who had been convinced to arrest Billy Wilson and Billy the Kid, and the whole lot of them. A few days after Pat Garrett was elected, Pat met with Agent Wild, and the two formed a plan to raid Fort Sumner. Agent Wild would write, quote, I am now engaged in making preparations to get 50 men together to go to Fort Sumner and arrest this gang of men. I will make a start soon as we have matured our plans and warrants reach me. End quote. He won't be able to gather 50 men, but he'd certainly make sure the heat was on. Meanwhile, over near Fort Sumner, the two Billies and many of this new Wilson gang were doing what they did best. They were stealing horses. This time, they were stealing from a certain Alexander Grzelachowski, a.k.a. Padre Polacco. Padre Polacco was a former Catholic priest from Poland. He had a large store and a bunch of horses. During this robbery, there's a story that Billy the Kid also stole a double-action Colt Lightning .38 revolver. I'm not sure if the story is true, but it is true that the two Billies stole Padre Polacco's horses and afterwards headed to a brand new pop-up mining town known as White Oaks to sell the stolen herd. In 1879, gold was found in a valley about 45 miles northwest of Lincoln, Overnight, the town of White Oaks was born. The town had 10 saloons, and in the mining boomtown was a man known as Tom Cooper, the king of the Tularosa. He gained a contract to provide beef to Fort Stanton, so naturally, the man did not always care where the cattle came from or the horses to use on said cattle. Billy the Kid and the Wilson gang had been selling their stolen lot to this Tom Cooper all summer, and after robbing Padre Palaco of 16 horses, they were headed back there again. On the way, though, Billy and the Wilson gang planned to stay overnight at a way station known as the Great House and Cooch Ranch. This spot that offered beds and a meal was itself about 40 miles north of White Oaks. Cooch was friendly with rustlers since he had once been a rustler himself, and Jim Greathouse wasn't the most honest man either. He was known as Jim Whiskey, and he was infamous for selling whiskey to the Apachos on the Mescalero Res. So the Great House and Cooch Ranch was a pretty friendly place for Billy the Kid and Billy Wilson and their gang, which on that day included the aforementioned Rudabog. The following morning, the whole gang rode south for White Oaks. But by now, the people in town were tired of the thieves, and the local sheriff, along with a posse of White Oak residents, decided they'd prevent them from entering, and then they would chase the thieves out of town. The mood in Lincoln County, and indeed all of New Mexico, was shifting. The people wanted civilization. With the Apache settled down, at least until Geronimo would escape shortly, and with the Lincoln County War over, the residents of the Southwest wanted peace. But a quick and important aside is needed. Not only was the Secret Service agent Wild gathering a large group of men to raid Fort Sumner with the newly elected Sheriff Pat Garrett, he was also devising a plan to send a spy into the two Billy's outfit. So Wild met with Garrett, and Garrett proposed the perfect infiltrator. That man would be Barney Mason. Barney Mason was also a Fort Sumner resident. He was a cowboy for Pete Maxwell, and he knew Billy Wilson and had even given the man a bed at his home. Barney Mason, therefore, also knew Billy the Kid and Folliard and Beaudry. According to Gardner, Barney Mason was a Virginian who had gone to Texas before heading to New Mexico. But in a weird story, although Barney Mason wasn't a man of the gun, he had shot and killed a random drifter the year before when this guy opened fire on Barney for no reason. Barney Mason then apparently exited the store where the shooting occurred, grabbed his gun, came back into the store, and shot the crazy man dead. So he was never charged. But he did become friends with Pat Garrett afterwards. Maybe they bonded over being forced to kill someone who was trying to kill them. Barney Mason was briefed by Garrett and then deputized by the special agent Wild. He would later be deputized by Pat Garrett himself as well. Barney Mason then rode to White Oaks in the hopes of meeting the two Billies and the Wilson gang, which he did on Sunday, November 21st, 1880. Okay, I will now let author George R. Matthews describe what happened next as the gang were trying to sell their horses. Quote, on Sunday, November 21st, Mason arrived in White Oaks. He put his horse up at the West and Diedrich stable, and that night, when he went to check on his horse, he met Wilson, Edwards, Cook, Rudabog, and Bonnie, who were leaving town. Mason, a fellow Fort Sumner resident, knew Bonnie and Wilson well. Wilson had stayed at Mason's house when he was first in Fort Sumner. Surprised to see Mason in White Oaks, someone, probably Wilson, asked Mason what brought him there. Mason replied he had come to steal horses. Mason's story must have been less than convincing. He became nervous, excused himself, and left the corral. End quote. So Barney Mason wasn't the best spy, but his story isn't over yet. About that White Oaks posse I mentioned earlier, once the deputy sheriff, William H. Hudgens, heard that the two Billies and the Wilson gang were in town, he gathered 8 men, and they rode towards the outlaws' camp. Here's Matthews again. Quote, taken by surprise, the thieves managed to mount their horses as the posse began firing. Wilson and Bonnie had their horses shot from beneath them and had to flee on foot. Rudabog, Cook, and Edwards escaped on horseback, racing away in different directions. Fortunately for Wilson and Bonnie, after Hudgens watched his quarry scatter to the four winds, for some reason known only to himself, he pursued no one and opted to return to White Oaks. Bonnie later explained, quote, "After mine and Billy Wilson's horses were killed, we both made our way to a station 40 miles from the Oaks kept by Mr. Greathouse." End all quotes. So they are now 40 miles north of White Oaks and back at the Greathouse and Cooch station. When they arrived, the two Billies were relieved to find Rudabog waiting there for them. Two of the other men that the deputy sheriff chased off would eventually just disappear from the historical record, hopefully leaving their outlaw ways behind them. Back in White Oaks, since the deputy sheriff had failed to pursue the outlaws, the town constable, a man named Tom Longworth, he decided he was going to finish the job. So Constable Longworth, along with the deputy sheriff Hudgens, the deputy's brother John Hudgens, and a future deputy to Pat Garrett and former Texas Ranger named James Bell. The White Oaks blacksmith named James Carlisle and 8 other men rode north towards the Greathouse and Cooch station to capture Billy the Kid and Billy Wilson and whoever else was holed up with them. They arrived at 3 a.m. on November 27th. It was a miserably cold morning, and it was still dark. They decided they were going to wait for the rising sun to attack. But in the meantime, they quietly built up fortifications in the freezing air and waited. Once dawn had broken and the world began stirring, the first to leave the cabin at the Greathouse and Cooch station was the cook, a German named Joe Steck. As soon as he was out the door, the German was captured and brought to the sheriff, who interrogated him about who was inside. The cook replied with Dave Rudabog, Billy Wilson, and Billy Bonnie, a.k.a. the Kid. Satisfied, the sheriff sent the cook back in with a message for Billy Wilson. The sheriff would like a word. Shortly afterwards, the German Steck returned with Greathouse and Cooch, but no Wilson. The 3 men had their own message from the outlaws inside. The 3 men inside asked if James Carlisle could come inside and join them. Mark Lee Gardner also wrote that Billy the Kid sent word that they would never surrender. Quote, "You can only take me as a corpse." End quote. There's no footnote or source, so I'm not sure if that happened. The sheriff, though, refused to send Carlisle into the den of thieves, despite Greathouse offering himself as a hostage to the posse. But eventually, Carlisle disarmed and volunteered to head inside. Once there, he attempted to arrest the 3 outlaws, but instead, they poured him a whiskey and the man got quite drunk. James Jimmy Carlisle. He was a popular man in White Oaks. Everyone liked the blacksmith. He had been on the first posse, and he was on this one as well. There's a small sentence in Gardner's book that states he knew Wilson from Ohio when they were kids, but I have no idea. It seems, though, that Carlisle was mad at the gang on account of them stealing his mules. He was there to get them back, or at least find out where they were. After many whiskeys and many hours, Carlisle decided he'd had enough fun and he wanted to leave. The outlaws refused this request, though, and the tension in the cabin began to build. What happens next is a little murky, and I read multiple differing accounts. I mean, even the survivors tell multiple different accounts. It seems the German Steck re-entered the house to make lunch. He noticed most of the men, especially Carlisle, were very drunk. And as I just mentioned, Carlisle wanted to leave, but the men were keeping him put basically as a hostage. Then at 2 p.m., the deputy sheriff Hudgens sent Cooch into the house to tell Steck that they needed to leave because the posse was about to storm the house. Now here's the murky part. I read in To Hell on a Fast Horse that the deputy sheriff told the outlaws that they had 5 minutes to release Carlisle or they would shoot Greathouse. Not sure if the deputy would actually say that, but then Gardner writes that the posse, 5 minutes later, fired a shot into the air. This startled Carlisle, who assumed Greathouse had just been murdered in cold blood.
So he shot up, leapt towards the window, and jumped out of it. Upon hitting the ground and recovering, Carlisle would run about 10 feet before being shot 3 times in the back. Carlisle would never get his mules back. I'm not sure if that story is the true story. I reckon as soon as Cooch came in and said they're about to storm the place, Carlisle got up and jumped through the window to save his own life. Billy Bonney would later claim a shot rang out from the outside which spooked the men. Regardless of what happened, Carlisle was now dead. Billy Wilson would say the shots came from the law posse, who assumed the man jumping out the window was one of the 3 outlaws, and so the posse killed the young blacksmith. Dave Rudabog would refute that, though, and say that Wilson was a, quote, damned liar. We all 3 shot at him. You and I fired 1 shot apiece, and the kid twice, end quote. It is hard to argue against that particular confession. And he'll say that later when they all get arrested. I think I'll mention it again. After the murder, the 3 outlaws took up defense positions and awaited an assault that would never come. The constable and the deputy sheriff, after the death of Carlisle, decided not to raid the house. They'd had no food or water for 24 hours. They were very cold, they were tired, and now they were demoralized. So the posse returned to White Oaks. By December 10th, the 2 Billies and Rudabog would be back at Fort Sumner, where they'd reunite their gang with Folliard, Charlie Beaudry, and Tom Pickett. But their reputation after the cold-blooded killing of the popular Carlisle, their reputation would be tarnished, especially Billy the Kid's going forward. The young man would lose a lot of support from once sympathetic residents of Lincoln County and Fort Sumner, especially over the winter of 80 to 81. And this slide of support would only accelerate. Special Agent Wild would acquire a Deputy U.S. Marshal star for Pat Garrett in November of 1880, since Garrett's tenure as sheriff wasn't set to start until January 1st of the following year. Along with Garrett, Agent Wild got Bob Olinger a star as well. When Wild appointed the men Deputy U.S. Marshals, he declared, quote, I have now had men commissioned as Deputy U.S. Marshals who will execute warrants for arrest or die in the attempt, end quote. Their first order of business that November, after assigning Barney Mason as a spy, was to finally gather a posse and raid Fort Sumner. The Garrett and Olinger posse included 11 other men, and they arrived at the fort on November 27th. But as the previous story highlights, Rudabog and the 2 Billies were out west. And Tom Folliard, Charlie Beaudry, and Tom Pickett, they were about 20 miles northeast of Fort Sumner, at a place known as Tom Yerby's Ranch. A lot of Toms in this story. Now I will let George R. Matthews describe what happened next during Garrett's hunt. Quote, Garrett and his posse rode toward Yerby's Ranch, about 12 miles from Fort Sumner. They spied a lone rider on the road ahead. He was a long distance from us, Garrett later said, but with the assistance of excellent field glasses, we recognized Tom O'Folliard. The posse took a shortcut through a pass in the hills and came out 300 yards behind Folliard. Surprised, Folliard spurred his horse and raced toward the ranch. Outdistancing the posse, he reached the ranch in time for Beaudry and Pickett to mount up, and the 3 rode away. Garrett failed to capture anyone at the ranch, but he did confiscate 2 mules that belonged to Billy Bonney. End all quotes. It had been a close call for the 3, especially Folliard. But they were on the move again. The noose was tightening around the ex-Regulators and their new friends. From Yerby's Ranch, Pat Garrett and his posse spent 4 days searching the countryside for any sign of the outlaws or any stolen cattle and horses. But they came up empty. Gardner, though, does describe a story where Charlie Beaudry met the sheriff-elect on December 9th. During this meeting, Pat Garrett tried to convince him to turn on Billy the Kid. I believe this story is probably from Pat Garrett's autobiography, so I'm not sure it can be too trusted. But the story has Beaudry say he's going to quit the gang, to which Garrett told him that he and his posse would, quote, sleep on their trail until we took them in, either dead or alive, end quote. A little too dime novelish, but he may have said it. I think an interaction occurred between the two, but I'm not sure if it went down as described. Plus, the timeline is a little wonky. By December 3rd, Pat Garrett was back at Fort Sumner, and still empty-handed. He sent his posse home, which was pretty much Roswell, that was their home, and then he and the spy Barney Mason met up and headed north together for Las Vegas. They were headed that way on account of capturing 2 escaped convicts during their traipse through New Mexico. It was the only success they had, which I guess is a big one. And I will talk about this trip to Las Vegas in a minute. Either the same day Garrett left for Las Vegas or the day after, Rudabog and the 2 Billies arrived to Sumner on the 10th, and no doubt, Beaudry informed the 3 of them about the posse that had been searching for him. Beaudry had, after all, been chased. Or rather, Tom Folliard had been chased and had warned Beaudry and Pickett to flee. Mark Lee Gardner calls Billy the leader of this Wilson gang throughout his telling. But I've already set that record straight when I pointed out that Billy Wilson was in fact the leader of the Wilson gang. Gardner may have gotten his facts twisted from a December 3rd, 1880 issue of the Las Vegas Gazette, which specifically calls Billy the Kid the leader. I'll actually quote Matthews for a couple paragraphs, in which he quotes this Gazette piece. Bonnie was also shown the December 3rd, 1880 issue of the Las Vegas Gazette. He read the editorial by J.H. Kugler that described an outlaw gang of 40 to 50 men, all hard characters, the off-scouring of society, fugitives from justice, and desperadoes by profession. Among them are men, with those names and deeds the people of Las Vegas are perfectly familiar, such as Billy the Kid, Dave Rudabog, Charlie Beaudry, and others of equally unsavory reputation. Bonnie may have paused and made a remark regarding his new sobriquet before he read, quote, "The gang is under the leadership of Billy the Kid, a desperate cuss, who is eligible for the post of captain of any crowd, no matter how mean and lawless," end quote. It was the first time that the moniker Billy the Kid appeared in print. The 20-year-old Bonnie may have made light of his characterization as a desperate cuss, perhaps mockingly proclaimed himself, not Wilson, as gang leader, and looking around, may have asked where were the other 40 to 50 hard characters. But Pat Garrett and his posse could not be taken lightly. It was time the 6 outlaws seriously considered their future plans. For Bonnie, the Gazette editorial gave him the opportunity, after a year and a half of silence, to reopen communication with Governor Wallace. End all quotes. So 2 days after returning to Fort Sumner, Billy the Kid wrote the governor of the territory of New Mexico, Governor Wallace, the man who owed him a pardon. He wrote the letter in the hopes of pushing back against that article, which had a bunch of inaccuracies in it. He really wanted that pardon. The letter said with some editing, quote, "I noticed in the Las Vegas Gazette a piece which stated that Billy the Kid was the captain of a band of outlaws. There is no such organization in existence. So, the gentleman must have drawn very heavily on his imagination. There is a great deal of cattle stealing going on in the territory, but so far as my being at the head of a band, there is nothing of it. I had been at Sumner since I left Lincoln, making my living gambling. J.S. Chisholm is the man who got me in trouble, and is now doing all he can against me. Deputy Sheriff Garrett, acting under Chisholm's orders, went to Portales Springs and found nothing. On his way back, went by Mr. Yerby's ranch and took a pair of mules of mine. If some impartial party were to investigate this matter, rustling, they would find it far different from the impression put out by Chisholm and his tools." End quote. Clearly, Billy Bonnie the Kid was not happy with Chisholm. But he was wrong about a few things too. Pat Garrett hadn't been set upon the Kid by John Chisholm. It was instead the Agent Wild, who wanted the men for a whole slew of things, especially counterfeiting greenbacks. After Billy wrote the letter, Charlie Beaudry told the kid and Wilson and the whole gang that they should leave New Mexico. And surprisingly, that is what the two Billies were planning on doing. So maybe Charlie did meet with the sheriff-elect Garrett after all. I'm still not sure. But the letter reached the governor too late. Wallace had read that same article, and he had come to the conclusion that he needed this whole thing over and done with yesterday. He also needed to finish his masterpiece novel, Ben-Hur. So the governor issued a reward notice for the kid, essentially sealing his fate, and ignoring the pardon he owed him. The notice read, quote, $500 reward. Notice is hereby given that $500 reward will be paid for the delivery of Bonnie, alias the kid, to the sheriff of Lincoln County, Lew Wallace, governor of New Mexico, Santa Fe, December 15th, 1880, end quote. It's telling that Billy the Kid was singled out and not Billy Wilson, the true leader. It's also telling that the murderer Rudabog was omitted. Instead, only Billy the Kid received the reward notice. The noose was about to be tightened further. On that same day, December 15th, Garrett and Mason were returning from Las Vegas. I thought about telling the long story of Garrett and Mason getting into a shootout with a posse who wanted to free the two prisoners they were taking to Las Vegas. But I don't know if it really happened or if Ash Upson and Garrett invented the story later, or at least embellished it. Regardless, Garrett and Mason were returning from Las Vegas when they met up with a bunch of those previously mentioned Panhandle cattle rustling law enforcement officers. They had newly been created. They were led by a man named Frank Stewart. He was the head of these cattle detectives. He was with around 12 men. When Garrett told them, the Texans, who were on their way to the White Oaks boomtown, when Garrett told them they were going to go arrest William Bonney the Kid, Stewart and 6 other men agreed to go capture some rustlers. That was their job after all. The rest of the men continued on to their duty of returning stolen livestock. Further down the road, Garrett, Mason, Stewart, and their posse gained 4 more recruits, including a man named Jose Roybal and his brother Juan. It was now early morning, Friday, December 17th, 1880. Garrett, fearing they'd be spotted, sent Jose Roybal into Fort Sumner to scout out and see if their outlaws were lurking about. Jose hadn't been in town long before he spotted Folliard and Pickett. But Jose, too, had been spotted. A stranger walking around the small town with no purpose. And then he suddenly rode out as fast as lightning after eyeballing the 2 Toms. Well, Pickett and Folliard leapt up on their horses as well and overtook Jose Roybal outside of town. They then asked the man who he was and what he was doing. Jose, with a cool head, told the 2 Toms his name and that he was out looking for his lost sheep. The answer seemed to satisfy the 2 Toms, who let the man go and rode leisurely back to town. After Jose Roybal had made it back to Garrett and the posse with the day's exciting news, the entire group rode overnight towards Fort Sumner. At the same time, the lawmen were riding towards Fort Sumner. The 2 Billies, the Kid and Wilson, Beaudry, Folliard, Rudabog, and Pickett, were riding east towards the Wilcox Brazil Ranch to purchase some beef. They had planned on this being one of their last nights in New Mexico, for soon they were riding to Old Mexico to start a new life, to escape the reward and the law, and to hopefully live out the last of their long days. That was the plan anyways. I'll now let Matthews describe what happens next. Quote, Saturday morning, just before the cold dawn, A.H. Beaver Smith was roused from sleep by his former bartender Pat Garrett and former Fort Sumner resident Barney Mason. When asked about the 6 fugitives, Smith said that they had left the night before but would return in a day or 2. As the word spread that Garrett, Mason, and a posse were in town, Bob Campbell, one of Bonnie's Fort Sumner friends, sent a young boy with a note to the Wilcox Brazil Ranch alerting the men there. On Sunday morning, December 19th, Bonnie sent Juan Gallegos, Wilcox's stepson, to scout Fort Sumner, but he put his trust in the wrong place. It was generally known that neither Gallegos nor his stepfather were friends of Billy Bonney. Spotting Gallegos, Garrett quickly conceived a plan to lure the outlaws back to town. He asked Juan to work with him, and Juan agreed to do anything Garrett asked. Garrett then coerced Jose Valdez, who was a true friend of Bonnie's, to write a note saying that Garrett and his posse had left Fort Sumner, heading to Roswell. Garrett then wrote a separate message telling Tom Wilcox and Manuel Brazil that he was in Fort Sumner with 13 men and asking for their cooperation. Garrett gave Gallegos both notes, warned him not to get them mixed up, and sent him back to the ranch. End quote. If you were wondering, or maybe hoping, that the notes got mixed up, or maybe someone would tip off the two Billies and their men to this plan, you'd be hoping in vain. The plan worked. Mark Lee Gardner describes well the hours that passed by as the trap was laid. He wrote, quote, Garrett knew that Beaudry's wife, Manuela, was now living in a room in the old Indian Hospital building. The hospital formed the northeast corner of the complex of buildings that made up Fort Sumner, and the road coming from the Wilcox Brazil place passed just behind it. Garrett figured that the gang would make the hospital building their first stop, so he placed a guard outside and stationed the rest of his posse inside. Also inside, with the posse, were a few Hispanic residents whom Garrett was holding in custody for fear that they would attempt to get word to the gang. At about 8 p.m., Garrett, Mason, and posse members Tom Emery and Bob Williams were deep into a game of poker. They had spread a blanket on the floor and were using that as their gambling table. Another posse member, Jim East, was in a corner rolled up in his blanket, trying to get some sleep before it was his turn at guard duty. Garrett was not expecting the gang until later in the evening, not for another 2 hours at the earliest. Just then, posseman Lon Chambers popped his head in. "Pat, someone is coming." "Get your guns, boys," Garrett said as he stood up from the floor. "None but the men we want are riding this time of night." End all quotes. So, sorry for quoting so much, but they just sum up the story so well. I might as well use their good words, and I will quote again from Matthews, who tells the story from the side of the outlaws. Early that evening, thinking that Garrett and his men had left Fort Sumner, Bonnie and his 5 companions slowly rode due west into the wind, huddled in their saddles against the cold, through the deep snow that lay on the road into Fort Sumner. The crescent moon that hung in the night sky provided little light. About 8 o'clock, as the riders approached the old Fort Hospital building on the eastern edge of town, Folliard and Pickett were in the lead, with Beaudry, Wilson, Rudabog, and Bonnie following a short distance behind. Folliard and Pickett pulled up to the building's east porch. 2 shots rang out. Pickett wheeled his horse and fled, Garrett firing at him but missing. Bonnie, Beaudry, Wilson, and Rudabog simultaneously reined about and fled east, away from town. A bullet had hit Folliard in the chest, slightly below the heart. He was able to stay in the saddle as his horse trotted away about 150 yards, then managed to turn it and walk slowly back to the hospital building. End quote. When Folliard had reached Garrett in the building, he muttered weakly, "Don't shoot, Garrett, I'm killed." It is reported that Barney Mason then cruelly told Folliard, quote, "Take your medicine, old man, take your medicine." End quote. Folliard, not an old man, was then taken from his horse and laid down on a blanket near the fire inside. After they laid Tom down, the lawmen went back to their poker game. But Folliard was struggling. He was in an immense amount of pain. Eventually, he would beg Garrett to kill him. He would basically say if Garrett was his friend, he would put him out of his misery. And here's Garrett. "I told him I was no friend to men of his kind, who sought to murder me because I tried to do my duty." End quote. Once the spy, Mason, entered the room, Folliard became a little afraid. And Pat Garrett assumed that Folliard was afraid because Mason probably would shoot him. He had already said, "Take your medicine." And then Folliard would cry, "Don't shoot anymore, for God's sake, I'm already killed." At this point, Mason would again cruelly tell him to take his medicine. Folliard would reply, "It's the best medicine I ever took." Folliard would go on to ask that his grandmother in Texas be informed of his death, before shouting, "Oh my God, is it possible I must die?" And then he started to curse. "God damn you, Garrett, I hope to meet you in hell." "I would not talk that way, Tom," said Garrett. "You are going to die in a few minutes." "The sooner the better. I will be out of pain." After Folliard became agitated yet again, he told Garrett, "Oh, go to hell, you long-legged son of a bitch." The young man then began to groan and ask for water. Garrett wrote later, quote, "He drank a little, lay back, shuddered, and was dead." End quote. One more regulator had fallen. Although I'm fairly certain their days of defending justice were over. Still, the loss was felt by Billy, especially. The two had been very close friends. Garrett and his men, as well as a few others at Fort Sumner, unceremoniously buried Tom Folliard in the fort's old cemetery, just before a heavy snowfall fell upon this lawless area of the territory. It was December 20th. While their friend was being buried, the two Billies, Rudabog, Pickett, and Beaudry had ridden hard back for the Wilcox Brazil Ranch, where they formulated a plan and waited out the snow. Actually, it's a little more exciting than that. Pickett's horse had died on the hard ride, and he'd walked in the snow back to the ranch, where he hid out until the others returned. And his horse wasn't the only horse that had keeled over. The men had just barely escaped. Well, Tom Folliard had not been so lucky. On the 21st of December, the two Billies sent Brazil, who again wanted nothing to do with the outlaws. The gang sent Brazil into Fort Sumner to scout out the area for any lawmen. But instead of scouting, Brazil went straight to Garrett and told he and his men that the outlaws were at his place, and they would only be there for a short time longer. Garrett told Brazil to tell the outlaws that the lawmen had dispersed or were on their way out, including Garrett himself. Pat was planning yet another surprise attack. The following day, Brazil relayed this information to the gang, who did not believe a word of it. They saw right through Brazil, so after they got some grub, they loaded up and headed east towards Texas. They were on the Texas road to a place called Stinking Springs, the same place that Chisholm had wanted Pat Garrett stationed as a deputy marshal earlier in the year. When the gang arrived at the place, they slept on the dirt floor of an old sheep herder's one-room rock cabin. It was a cold night. I'm not sure why, but before they attempted to sleep, they brought in two horses with them into the cabin. Maybe to hide their numbers, maybe to provide some warmth. One of the horses was Billy the Kid's own. Right after the outlaws had left Brazil's, the man rode hard for Fort Sumner to tell Garrett and his posse that the outlaws had left his place and were heading east. They were making their getaway. Garrett and the men left Fort Sumner at midnight. They did not want to lose the trail. Once at Brazil's, they followed the trail of the outlaws in the hard snow. But Garrett knew where they were heading. He knew they'd be stopping at Stinking Springs. It was now December 23rd, and Garrett and his men had arrived about 400 yards outside of the cabin at around 3 a.m. The men quietly dismounted and left one man with the horses. Stewart and Garrett then divided the rest of the posse and began their silent assault. Garrett and his crew followed a dry arroyo and got up pretty close to the cabin. Stewart and his men approached as close as they could, about 200 yards. They would be waiting in the bitter cold until first light. It was cold. One of the men would suffer from frostbite for the rest of his life on account of this freezing cold early morning stakeout. Once dawn had broken, movement stirred within the cabin, and a man emerged with some grain for the three horses tied to the cabin. and the cabin had no door. 2 of the horses and the rest of the men were still inside. Once the man had stepped fully outside with the bag of food for the beasts, Garrett gave a predetermined signal, and the entire posse simultaneously opened fire on the outlaw. He took several bullets. He then whipped around and stumbled back inside the old cabin. They'd hit Charlie Beaudry, and Billy Wilson would scream that fact at the posse of lawmen. Billy Wilson then screamed that the dying man wanted to surrender. Garrett responded with, "Well, send Beaudry out." The dying man left the old stone cabin, his hands in the air. He slowly stumbled towards Garrett and the posse, all the while choking on his own blood. He began to point towards the cabin as he got closer to Garrett and said, quote, I wish, I'm dying." End quote. Garrett would later say that, quote, "I took hold of him, laid him gently on my blankets, and he died almost immediately." End quote. Another ex-Regulator had bit the bullet. I'll now let Matthews tell of the surrender and capture of the remaining outlaws, including Billy the Kid. Quote, "The 4 men left inside the cabin conceived a desperate plan. If they could get 2 more horses inside, they could swing into their saddles and make a break for it through the open doorway. When Garrett noticed a moving rope pulling a horse toward the doorway, he realized the fugitives were planning a break. As the horse reached the cabin's entrance, Garrett fired and the horse fell dead, blocking the doorway. Garrett's men simultaneously shot the other 2 horses. The 4 men left inside were trapped. After killing Beaudry and foiling the escape plan, Garrett rode with half his men back to the Wilcock Brazil Ranch for breakfast, only 3 miles away, leaving the other half to watch the cabin. Upon returning, Garrett sent the other men. The hours passed, but still Bonnie, Pickett, Rudabog, and Wilson refused to surrender. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Brazil brought a wagon loaded with food, firewood, and forage for the horses. The tantalizing smell of roasting meat soon drifted toward the 4 hungry outlaws. Soon, Rudabog waved a dirty white handkerchief from the cabin's doorway and called out that they wanted to surrender. Garrett told them to come out with their hands up. Rudabog came out alone and said they would all surrender if Garrett, quote, would guarantee them protection from violence, end quote. Garrett agreed. Rudabog returned to the cabin, and after a few minutes, the 4 men walked out, their hands raised. Barney Mason said, "Now, Pat, let's kill the sons of bitches." Lou Bozeman, Lee Hall, and Jim East, 3 of Stewart's Panhandle men, drew their guns on Mason, and one said, "You dirty son of a bitch, just try that, and we'll cut you in 2, and Pat too." Mason backed down. Bonnie, Pickett, Wilson, and Rudabog were disarmed. End all quotes. Now, of course, Gardner has a slightly different story, although again I have no idea what the source is. I believe it's Pat Garrett's own autobiography, which, yes, I probably should have read it. But after asking a bookshop owner here in New Mexico in Old Town, and after doing a little bit of my own research, I was, I believe, reliably informed that the book is full of outlandish dime novel tales of exaggerated stories and whatnot. Plus, most sources I read use his book with some skepticism, although I think Gardner might rely on it a bit too much. But Gardner says that after Beaudry was shot, the kid placed a cocked and loaded pistol in his pants and told him, "They have murdered you, Charlie, but you can get revenge. Kill some of the sons of bitches before you die." I have no idea if that really happened or not. Regardless, Charlie Beaudry was never able to fire one last shot. And with that, Billy the Kid and the rest of the remaining gang have been captured by Sheriff-elect Pat Garrett. Although Billy the Kid's story ain't over yet, there's still an infamous daring escape, more shootouts, and more harrowing adventures await the young outlaw in New Mexico. before Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid's final encounter. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, the track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.